Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we've been doing trying to talk about Baudrillard on the space privatization resolution. This has been a really interesting series for me because I've been able to talk about something that I think is really interesting for this resolution, that I think asks some really critical questions about the way in which various types of cultural imagery and ideas about how we view the future relate to the various types of political decisions that we're making, or like other kind of ideas that we're being able to push in terms of like how we're thinking about the relationship between various types of symbolic imagery and how we think about various types of policy and other ways of organizing, the way in which we just kind of like go out and relate to the world and various types of other cultural issues as a result. In this video, I kind of want to continue that series as we begin to talk about what it looks like to answer affirmatives that are reading Baudrillard. In the last two videos, I talked a little bit about what Baudrillard as an affirmative strategy looks like and what I think it can do against various arguments like case arguments, framework arguments, T arguments, criticism, counterplans, and disads. And in these next two videos, I want to talk a little bit about what I think in terms of how we're able to find various ways to answer Baudrillard affirmatives and the various ways that you can use some of these positions, case arguments, framework and T arguments, criticisms, counterplans, and disads to build out really nuanced explanations of how you want to answer a lot of these affirmatives. And so hopefully with being able to think about some of the priorities against these affirmatives and some other ideas, you're able to figure out ways that you can go beyond just like some of the more general kind of critiques of Baudrillard writ large and think about some more nuanced critiques of the way that they're kind of framing the theory in the context of what it means for space and space privatization, which I think is super important in terms of just having like more specific arguments and a better way of dealing with these affirmatives as they pop up overall. The first thing I would definitely look at is just thinking about what are your priorities against some of these affirmatives. I definitely think that against a lot of these affirmatives that may take up things like radical mimicry, it can be really interesting for you to be able to ask questions about their ability to defend the material basis of the plan text. Obviously, most Baudrillard teams, if they're probably more experienced in this argument, are going to say that they don't need to defend the fiat kind of interpretation of it. But I actually think that there is some really interesting benefit for them like playing and acting around as if they do. And I think that being able to test the grounds on how far they'll go in terms of being able to defend the kind of like material points of their advocacy is really important, not just because that you could get them sucked into a debate that could actually be unstrategic for them if they go too far, but also because it means that they have to spend time developing like what their method actually does outside of the material, which thus gives you a lot more offense to kind of spike off of in terms of what you can turn for what it does at the level of like what we do in debate and like what it kind of like affirms epistemologically. And I think that being able to ask and be able to sort through those questions is really important and a really good place to be able to poke against these arguments. The second thing is that I think particularly on the space privatization question, I think that really having clear arguments if you're a policy team that really define how you're really strategically thinking about going for framework and T is super important and something that I want to go over in this video, because I do think there are some really tricky arguments they can bring out about like what the topic actually mandates versus like what most fiat interpretations are actually doing. And I think that being able to sort out how you want your interpretation to really be understood by judges and the way you want to think about like what the burdens of each team should be in order to create a basis for competition could be like really helpful in order to just build really good theories of how you're thinking about like what competition against this affirmative should be broadly and how you can use it for like what other type of argument you may be able to go for if they're not framework and T arguments. And so hopefully by kind of like understanding these priorities, we can understand what we should kind of be trying to accomplish a little bit more as we move forward into thinking about what more specific arguments we could be reading. When I'm thinking about some arguments in terms of case that are probably the most important when thinking about some of these priorities, I would think that the first thing that is probably super important is that instead of just focusing on arguments that are just kind of like your base indict to Baudrillard, that I definitely still think should be present in the debate, because I think there is a place to just kind of like indict their overall theory of how things like signs and symbols kind of operate and like their power and etc. But I think that being able to add in more case arguments that are nuanced specifically about the relationship that the public and things like information have towards space is like super important. I think that if you're on the policy side of things, a lot of the case arguments you want to make are about why the public is such an influential force over space, and actually that the public is kind of the source of how like we're able to actually think about the mediation of symbols and signs in the context of space and not the other way around basically. And so I think that kind of by trying to inverse or flip around the way in which they're thinking about the internal link to how like these types of policies or like shifts actually are made, you can make a lot of arguments about why information is persuasive, why it's necessary for being able to have up-to-date understandings of space because of the way in which like we learn like different kind of ideas and scientific facts about like the way in which space operates every day, and why that kind of like knowledge is important for keeping like a really like well-informed public that's able to make decisions about space that are actually helpful for the overall well-being. And I also think making arguments on cases that are able to kind of like lead you in, regardless of whether or not on this particular tip, if you're a K or policy, if you're able to lean into making arguments that get you towards the type of impact comparison that you want to make, I definitely think that either if you're trying to find a way to make arguments about why there is innate value to thinking about the survivability of human life, or just why broadly the idea that Baudrillard is kind of like writing on still assumes or is able to only think about and register violence at the level level of like whether or not we should save the human are all really interesting places for you to like show critical inquiry, whether you're on the policy side or the case side, because from the case side it means that there are still ideals of humanism kind of like latent in Baudrillard or posthumanism, etc., that you can kind of like critique and use as a basis for your structural criticism. Or on the other side, it means that you can make arguments about like what you think should be the value of like the reason why we do politics and make particular decisions, which are all important in terms of how the judge is able to evaluate what some of the other portions of the debate are going to have, especially if you're combining them with some of those more generic Baudrillard arguments that you still kind of like have laying around in terms of being able to just indict why overall his theory may be bad in terms of the way in which it leads us to make particular types of political decisions. Additionally, I think that when you're thinking about some of the terms for what framework and T are really going to look like, I think that a lot of the concerns are whether or not you can do things in terms of framework and T in terms of making your interpretation of the resolution clear. I think a lot of the things that I've kind of like instructed Baudrillard teams to do, and what I think that a lot of teams will do if they go this route, is by making arguments about why fiat-ed interpretations of the resolution are extra topical because of the way in which they embolden the creation of new public space programs, which is like not an inherent part of the resolution and is something that may be an after effect of banning privatization, but adds like a serious amount of advantage ground that's already kind of like unpredictable to prepare for, and making arguments about why that kind of like reading of the topic has already basically made things that are kind of like particularly extra topical or things that are already unfair basically the center of the resolution. And I think in order for you to kind of like fix this with your argument about the resolution is that I think that you should make an argument that really holds the line in terms of why you restrict what assets should be read, not just based off of fiat interpretation, but also like you should say that the extra topical advantages are bad. And I think making arguments about why that changing the agent and opening up the agents in addition to leaving open the possibility for extra topical affirmatives, which is the AFS interpretation, actually leads to more unfairness, more predictability, which could cause the tricking a lot more of your impacts, instead of trying to win that you have to defend like every form of fiat like interpretation of the resolution. Because I think that even if you're able to also deploy those things and then give examples to things like the TVA of what it could look like to refuse privatize like space exploration or privatize space development without having to do the extra topical portions of the topic that a lot of other kind of like fiat affirmatives are doing in the status quo, then you have a much easier time kind of trying to get out of a lot of the indicts that they're making about like how fiat has to be overall. And you can make arguments about like why there's a multitude of ways in which we can actually embody and use fiat in ways that are really, really useful. Hopefully this video gives you a lot of base ideas for what you can do in terms of Baudrillard, answering these Baudrillard arguments when they're around the affirmative and space resolution. Hopefully you'll tune in to more videos I'll be doing with Baudrillard, space, and all other types of stuff for LD. Thank you so much for tuning in.